I completely agree. One question, though, that at least in my mind and that I've heard other people voice is, this does not punish Assad or the Syrian government for doing something heinous against their own people. And initially, one of the arguments, and I can't quote it, but something that John Kerry said when he made the initial argument on August 30th was not only about the abrogation of the norm of the use of weapons, but the horrible, the reflection on the leaders of Syria, and also giving that if something wasn't done, it would send the wrong signal to other nasty people in the world that they could use these weapons with impunity. What do you say about that? I mean, the comment of whether using force is legal or not, what does that do about the impunity question?
That's what we have the International Criminal Court to take care of. The issue is how you get them there, and whether or not there's jurisdiction, which is a very tricky question. But no, it will not solve that question, the action so far, and nor will it solve the civil war itself. In fact, there's a risk that it may intensify it for a time, the action. So it's a game changer, but it's very limited. I do want to say that Dean Stavridis gave another legal argument, if I may, which was under Article 51 of the Charter, there's collective self-defense, and he argues that Turkey requested, but Turkey didn't request very loud. So, but they might still do it. But that only takes you part way until the Security Council can act.
Yeah, so you used the word punishment, and I guess I would say that military action, the use of force against a state, is not a good form of punishment. If you're talking about punishing the individuals who are responsible, then do it through whatever judicial or other processes you can bring to bear. But the notion that use of force would be appropriate here somehow to punish Assad if it turns out that Assad is responsible, I guess that remains to be determined officially. But if it turns out he's responsible, I don't think that in itself is the right approach to questions about the use of force. I think the use of force in these circumstances really has to come down to, are you deterring ongoing violence in the country through that use of force? The question there is, does a political will exist? And we've seen that the political will didn't exist until now. It's conceivable that the political will exist sometime in the future if we end up right back where we started after all of these diplomatic efforts to bring the situation under control.
Professor DeWalt.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's been an extraordinary few weeks. What Syria has shown, among many other things, is that America needs a school of law and diplomacy. And hey, presto, what this evening shows is that maybe it has one. I think it also shows a rather fundamental weakness in the US administration. Not just this administration, but successive administrations. One would have hoped that the use of force would be in the service of diplomacy and political strategy. Sadly, I think what we see too much under this administration and its predecessor is that diplomacy is in the service of the use of force. And I think it is the lack of a political strategy backed by diplomacy and indeed law, international law as a practice, It's the lack of that that actually led the United States into a cul-de-sac of threatening force, really out of desperation, out of lack of a sensible option. Fortunately, we are now in a situation where there is a prospect of restarting negotiations. Who would have thought that Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, would be riding to the rescue and presenting himself to the world as the savior of multilateralism and diplomacy. But the fact that he managed to do that, I think, casts something of a shadow over the State Department, National Security Council, and the political cadre leading this country. The options that are being discussed now should have been actively pursued a couple of years ago. That they were not, I think, it is a failure of the international community as a whole and of this government. The outrage that was felt in this country against the use of chemical weapons was also felt in the countries that are supporters, friends of the Syrian government. The outrage was felt in Russia, it was felt in Iran. Let's not forget that Iran was also the victim of chemical weapons. And there are tens of thousands of Iranians still suffering the effects of chemical weapons that were used 25 years ago, and several thousand of them still hospitalized. And the outrage that was felt was not a unilateral outrage, it was a multilateral outrage. It was across the world. And that, including, as I said, amongst the staunchest allies of Assad. And that could have been used, and may still be used, to actually bring far more effective pressure to bear on the Syrian regime than the threat of cruise missiles. Maybe not far more effective, certainly comparably effective, I should say. We have a pretty good idea of what the formula is for getting to a negotiated solution. It's getting everybody round the table and talking. Getting all the Syrians around the table, and that includes the government of Syria. It's, in my view, a mistake for the US government to have said 2 years ago that Assad must go. That may have been a position you want to get to at some point during the talks. It is not a very good place to start your diplomatic venture. You need to get the neighboring countries, including Iran, around the table. So it is not a good idea to say, we don't want to talk to Iran. The whole point of negotiating peace is you talk to your enemies. If you're only talking to your friends, you're never going to get them. And of course you need to talk to Russia, unfortunately. That has been happening. One of the problems in Syria has been too much intervention, not too little. I'm of the view that intervening more without an overall political strategy would be to exacerbate the situation. I think we need less intervention. We need less intervention, obviously, from those who have been supporting the government in Syria, but also from Saudi Arabia and Qatar. The friends of the West, so-called friends of the West, who have been arming some fairly insalubrious characters on the other side. I think the idea that some have voted that having the two radical groups, that those of Bashar al-Assad and the radicals on the other side, fight each other into the ground and destroy each other, I think this is not only fanciful but extremely unethical. The experience of protracted wars is actually, however many people they kill, more extremists, more radicalized, traumatized, angry people come out of it at the end than going into it at the beginning. It's not as though you can simply say there are a certain number of bad people in the world, let's knock them off one by one. It doesn't work like that. So I think the formula is there for getting to an agreement. It's likely to be very slow. It's likely to have a lot of false starts and stops. It's likely to be painful. But I think the necessity for getting there is now more evident than ever. And I think this is the moment to seize on that necessity and to make threats such as they are ancillary supportive to pushing them forward. And I would add another very practical element here. I think, as Professor Chase was saying, we collectively, the Americans, also the Russians, know very well how to do arms inspections, verification, control, and destruction. But it was extraordinarily difficult, I would imagine, to do that in the middle of a war. I would suggest that any international inspectors who are going to go there are going to say, we want a ceasefire first, for very obvious reasons. So I suspect that in order to pursue this option, we're going to have a ceasefire, and let's hope we do. And in order to have a ceasefire, then that has its own implications as well for the pursuit of a solution. A ceasefire means diplomatically dealing with both sides, with all sides. Last point on accountability. In the op-ed that I co-authored with my colleague Bridget Connolly-Zilkich about advocating not striking, some people were surprised to see us advocating taking those responsible to an international court, because I've been well known as a critic of the ICC. My criticisms have not been muted. I think would be a potential if the prosecutor of the ICC were to issue an arrest warrant for President Assad. There would be a serious problem there, because it would be obviously a major disincentive for him to come to the negotiating table and to negotiate a peace agreement. That wasn't what we were advocating. For reasons of space, we were not able to explore it. What we would advocate is that the issue of accountability for war crimes be on the agenda for peace negotiations, for a number of reasons. Number one, it's something that can be agreed upon by reasonable people wanting to end a horrific war. But more importantly, it's only if there is agreement on that by the domestic actors and the regional actors that there's any chance of any decisions, such as arrest warrants, actually being enforced. Otherwise, they're just going to be hanging there, like the arrest warrant against President Bashir of Sudan, which will never be enforced unless the Sudanese actually want it to be enforced. And if it can only be enforced when that country wants it to be enforced, why not put it on the negotiating table and make it part of the consensus that arises? Maybe, of course, that the accountability is not pursued up to the highest level. And it may be that, in fact, it wasn't the highest level that authorized it. It should be pursued up to the appropriate level where the evidence suggests, where the evidence takes one. So the argument would be accountability needs to be part of an inclusive and holistic peace negotiation package. It's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but ultimately it will be faster, it will be less painful, and indeed it will be a lot less expensive to pursue that option than to pursue the current option.
I do have a question for you, Professor DeWaal. There were lots of negotiation attempts. Kofi Annan, Lakhdar Brahimi. Mr. Annan actually resigned in frustration over those negotiations, and Brahimi has been on the verge of doing so as well. You mentioned using threats to get people to the table. How is that different from what we're seeing right now? I mean, what would you imagine a process to be that would actually get the relevant actors into a room negotiating in good faith when they feel that they might still be able to prevail on the military front?
Well, I would hope that what's happened in the last few weeks would be a wake-up call, would be a realization that it is not possible for either side to win this without winning a wasteland. That should have been the case before, and I think there was an unfortunate tendency for a number of reasons to allow, indeed even encourage, some of the regional actors to funnel arms and money into various groups. I think now is the moment to say this meddling, this funneling of arms, it has to stop. This is the moment when we have seen the possibility of Syria going completely over the precipice, and let's collectively step back. There's never a guarantee that these processes are going to be anything other than slow and painful with a lot of false starts. But as Churchill said, jaw is a lot better than war. So let us make the main effort on that. If a fraction of the effort that were expended upon pursuing overt and covert military options had been spent on the diplomatic option, it would have been a lot further along.
Do any of you want to ask a question of each other before we open it up to the floor? I think we're ready to open it up. Okay, I think we're going to use microphones, yes? I don't know if these other mics are going to be usable by the panelists.
Yeah, I think we should say this one.
All right, okay. So if you would please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and we will come to find you with a microphone. And what I'd like to do is to hear from a couple or two or three people before we turn it back to the panel, and also see if we can get some conversation going around some themes so we're not jumping all over the place. Please.
Thank you for coming and for talking with us. I'm curious about this distinction between diplomacy in the service of war or vice versa. And if we look at the US administration, there are fairly senior officials who have been in senior positions in this kind of situation before, or studied and written Pulitzer Prize winning books about this kind of situation. And so I'm curious if any of the panelists could speak about why it seems this administration didn't do more along the lines of diplomacy and legal means. For example, proposing the elimination of chemical weapons earlier, and as opposed to waiting until now.
Can we take a couple more questions? There's one over here.
First of all, thank you very much to the panelists. Excellent points all of you have raised. And just for the sake of record, at the outset, the session is being videotaped. I've taken the floor as a Fletcher student and not as a representative of my government. Sir, my concern is that we are analyzing a very important issue, the issue of Syria, attack on Syria, relying heavily on the legal argument. Like in the backdrop, we have the legal argument, whereas we have another reality on the ground. And that reality is that yet another time, the custodian of international peace, and of course I am referring to United Nations Security Council, is not delivering. So don't you think that our recommendations on policy on this issue, our analysis of this issue, would not be complete? We just talk about US taking a unilateral action. Shouldn't we also be talking about the reforms in the UN? Thank you.
One more right down here.
My question actually relates to the intelligence mentioned earlier. So the UN report came out today, and I'm sure you guys have all read the summary. My question has to do with the fact that the report doesn't state that the army or Assad's regime was in fact responsible. Isn't it dangerous to operate under the premise or the assumption that the regime was in fact culpable and to base all of our policy around it?
So there's three themes here about, one is about the US administration and why it did not in fact pursue a diplomatic option earlier, given that some of our high-level people have been, have written about in support of that. Also, what about the UN Security Council? Why aren't we more critical of them and taking them to task? And aren't we jumping to conclusions if we don't have all the facts? Panelists, who would like to take any of these?
Take the questions in order. Why not propose the elimination of chemical weapons earlier? I think the administration says that it has been pushing for some years to get the Syrian government to accede to the Chemical Weapons Convention. I don't know to what extent that pressure has been significant. I think that they have had limited tools available to them to exert pressure, given the Russians standing behind their client state and the Security Council. It's very difficult to impose sanctions when the Russians have been standing up for the Assad regime to the extent that they have. Is it dangerous to assume the culpability of the Assad regime absent concrete evidence? I think it is. I certainly would insist upon far greater specificity of the evidence that's presented to Congress. I mean, I believe they've presented only a 4-page summary, and a number of senators have said that they've simply got to ante up and show much of the raw intelligence on which these very bare conclusions have been based. I think we ought to have learned our lesson from Iraq, and it's not simply Iraq. It's you know, this nation has a number of times gone to war with inadequate evidence that the state that we've been attacking is a transgressor. The dean has a picture on his wall of the battleship Maine, you know, which is the cause of the United States going to war against Spain was the alleged bombing of the battleship Maine by the Spanish military, but it turns out historically that that wasn't the case at all. It was an explosion in the boiler room. It was not caused by sabotage or an attack. You know, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was, we all know now, based on a simply false reporting of supposed attacks in the Maddox and Turner Joy in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee held hearings, and the former chief of staff of the committee used to describe walking into the office of the former staff member who got the logs of the Maddox, and was down on his hands and knees on the floor looking at a very large map, and he looked up and said, "They weren't there." He said, "Well, what do you mean? Well, the Maddox wasn't where Lyndon Johnson said it was when the attack occurred." I've said this before, but I think it may come as a shock to some people. Senator Fulbright, chairman of the committee during this period of time, was asked, Mr. Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee longer than anyone else in history, whether there's anything he learned that shocked him over the course of his chairmanship, and he said, yes, there was. The government lies. So I think that we've got to be skeptical about this kind of evidence and insist upon seeing it. Finally, on the question of Security Council reform, I think that there are 3 truths about the United Nations Security Council. It doesn't work, it can't be fixed, and we can't get rid of it. I say that with sorrow more than anger, but the truth is that if you measure it against the yardstick of the United Nations Charter itself, the first purpose set out in the United Nations Charter is to save humanity from the scourge of war, save future generations from the scourge of war. And it hasn't done that. There have been between 200 and 680 incidents that have represented violations of the prohibition against use of force in Article 2.4 since 1945. And that doesn't even count the number of civil wars, which are, of course, not addressed by the United Nations Charter. It's directed entirely at interstate conflict, not civil war. So not only is it, in my mind, a failure, it's anachronistic.
Picking up on what you said about government lines, one of the immediate precursors to Syria was Libya. And I think it was very unfortunate, to say the least, that the US pushed through a Security Council resolution in 1973 on Libya, which disavowed regime change. It was an R2P resolution, and I think as an R2P resolution, it was justifiable. And it gained the acquiescence of key powers, including Russia, which could have vetoed it and regretted later that it had not vetoed it, because immediately afterwards the US, France, and Britain then moved into regime change mode. And I think it was that possibly more than anything else that led to the Russian policy of consistent blockage over Syria, and the distrust and the impasse of the UN Security Council. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. I think in my view, what should have been pursued on Libya was a diplomatic option, because there was one of a negotiated settlement to that conflict. I think in terms of books that by members and former members of this administration, Vali Nasser's book based on his time working with Richard Holbrooke is well worth reading, and it sort of hinges around the remark that General David Petraeus made about Richard Holbrooke being my wingman, and he meant it as a compliment. But I think it really ought to be the other way around, as I said. I think Samantha Power's book, A Problem from Hell, is profoundly problematic. I think it reads history backwards, and it reads these complex events in countries like Rwanda, like Nazi Germany, and subsequently, one can imagine that someone like her might write one about Syria. It reads them from the point of view of the only ending, or the only satisfactory ending to these affairs being an international or US-led military intervention. And that's actually not how it happens. Very, very rarely does anything resembling that type of heroic ending actually transpire. These things almost invariably end in much more complicated diplomatic, political ways, usually internal to the country concerned, with perhaps some external mediation. And I think we're in the serious danger of taking a handful of extreme cases from the last 100 years, holding them up as a model and applying them inappropriately, even indiscriminately, to cases where they simply don't work.
I think we have to live with the history that we have. I said we have a good history on arms control. We have a bad history on our behavior in many other respects. The world really doesn't trust the United States now because of Iraq. And in fact, many of our congresspeople, even those who would just, not oppose President Obama on principle, which there are quite a few, but we have to live with that history. We have to live with the lies that were told, and therefore, I think it's unfortunate that this administration cloaks itself in secrecy to such a great extent. I totally agree that there has to be some revelation of the evidence of the intelligence on which we are basing our conclusion. Samantha Power, in a statement today, talked about the nature of the rockets that only the government had, the rocket parts. I mean, there has to be just a lot more of that. I think probably in this case the evidence is there, but everybody has to be satisfied to be able to move on. I think I don't quite agree with my colleague Alex on diplomacy, because I think the U.S. was wise to have the diplomacy conducted at the international level. It is true, we tend to look to military force as the United States too quickly, but I think to have the diplomacy conducted by international figures was the best way to go, and it hasn't succeeded. So on reforms in the UN, we ought to keep trying, maybe someday, but Americans can't have it both ways. If we want, we can't have Russia relinquish the veto and we keep it. And that's been a huge problem. Very big ambivalence. But Ian is the expert on that.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that one, the Security Council reform. I agree that on Syria, the Security Council has not delivered. The Security Council hasn't been able to adopt one resolution on Syria in 2.5 years, even a resolution which might have facilitated the political process that Alex was talking about. Will this stimulate Security Council reform? The failures in Syria? I somehow doubt it. And the reason for that is I think there will only be Security Council reform when we get to the point where it is widely seen as completely ineffective and therefore is no longer seen as an instrument that those 5 permanent members can use. And arguably, at various points in its history, we've got close to that, but events over the last few days suggest that, however useless it seemingly has been over the last 2.5 years, suddenly it's starting to look useful. Now, if it turns out it's impossible to have any kind of resolution, any kind of action in the Security Council in order to move forward this little bit of progress that's been made through the agreement, then we may be back to talking about is it completely useless. But it always somehow finds a way of doing just enough to keep it alive. And this is only Syria, of course. We can't judge the Security Council based only on one place. There are always going to be situations where there are going to be fundamental differences among the great powers, and no configuration of the Security Council is going to solve that problem. In the meantime, there are other places where the Security Council has demonstrated its value, and I kind of think that's why it will continue to muddle along for the foreseeable future without much reform.
We have a couple of Twitter generated questions, which Tamisha is going to read.
Okay, first question is from Maria. I think Maria is somewhere here. Was the obsessive focus on the chemical weapons of mass destruction used as a substitute for military humanitarian intervention because of Iraq? And one from Uzair, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Why is it that the question of accountability is only raised for non-allies of the United States? There were others, but we can start with those.
Sorry to interrupt, there's also a question from across the room.
Okay, hi.
Thank you. First, thank you all for being here tonight. This has been a very interesting panel. Professor Johnstone, you mentioned earlier that it's a very dangerous track for the U.S. to go down to remain the world superpower, and I think that's been an argument espoused by the administration as well, and it's a very credible argument. But just to play devil's advocate, I think time and time again we've seen if the U.S. doesn't act or debate action, then no one else will. And I'm wondering if you think the world without American engagement or debate of engagement over issues like this is more dangerous than a world in which the U.S. remains the sole superpower, for lack of a better term. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Nadim Rouhana. I'm a lecturer professor. I'm on sabbatical this year. And I just came back from the Middle East. I spent the last 2 months and a half all over the Middle East. And obviously, we were watching this drama unfold. My colleagues justifiably talked about the role